And we're good to go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Stream 3 of the 4th Annual Digital Transformation in Government Conference. My name is Steve Donahoe, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Session will be recorded and will be available on the conference website in the next day or so. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will pose those questions to our speaker at the end of his talk. Next speaker is Murray Kronick. His presentation is entitled, Digital Transformation is Not About Transformation, It's About Getting the Results. Murray is a part-time professor, long-term appointment with the Telfer School of Management. He recently retired as a vice president with BDO Consulting, with over 30 years of experience in management consulting. In his consulting practice, he has led notable projects for the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, including developing the Business Case Guide, the Outcome Management Guide, and the key elements of the policy on the management of projects, namely the Organizational Project Management Capability Assessment and the Project Complexity and Risk Assessment. Murray was a past president of the Performance and Planning Exchange, the PPX, and a board member for over 10 years, where he taught the Results-Based Management 101 and 201 courses. He was an editor of the monthly performance management column for the Canadian Government Executive magazine for 5 years. He is a certified management consultant and a fellow certified management consultant, and is a national instructor for both the Essentials of Management Consulting and Ethical Behavior for Management Consultants courses since 2009. Please join me in welcoming Murray Kronick.
Thank you, Steve. I was worried that you were going to use up all my time with the introduction there for a moment. Just kidding. What my job here today is, and welcome everybody, I know you've been talking about transformation all the way through, how to do it, what similar successful projects are in other jurisdictions, and I love the international nature of this as well. I'm here to challenge you today to say, as Stephen said for the title, it's not just about transformation, it's about getting the results of that transformation. Why do we do it? Why bother doing this in the first place? What are we trying to achieve through that transformation? And so that's the perspective I'm going to take with you for the next 40 minutes or so, to be able to walk you through a different perspective, a proven, tried and true method that's been around for quite a few years that I developed for Treasury Board Secretariat, as Steve mentioned. That is still available on the TBS website, and you'll see references throughout my presentation. So let me kind of put you at ease a little bit and allow me to say, okay, so transformation really is about transformation, but about what's the end of it? What's the end result, the end purpose of it? And so what I discovered through some research that I've done through the years is the following. This scary quote: even those projects that are delivered on time and on budget, and we all know what that's about, the majority, I think it was 54%, if I remember the number correctly, failed to deliver the expected business outcomes. So kind of like the equivalent of the operation was a success, but the patient died. And so obviously that's not the outcome, broadly speaking, that we want to achieve. And so the recommendation by this PMO Executive Council who did the work was, the study was, you need to extend your focus beyond just delivering what the functionality of the project is to delivering what those business outcomes are going to be. And those can be any number of things. It can be faster service, it can be cheaper service, it can be providing a new program in a hurry. And I think of CERB as just a simple example that obviously took place over the pandemic, record time to pull together a program and get it out the door. It can be any number of things that are really the end outcomes that the senior managers, the deputy heads, whoever it is that is looking for that outcome is trying to achieve. And so what the 5 key findings of the study was that it's necessary to, of course, deliver on time and on budget, but not sufficient to deliver the business outcomes. The next one was only a certain number of the classic project management activities actually link to driving those business outcomes along the way. So many of those project activities might be things like status reports or resourcing considerations or putting elements in place. Necessary things, but not necessarily directly connected to business outcomes. Interestingly enough, the PM, the project manager, is the #1 driver. So you'd better make sure that your project manager or project director, or whoever it is who's driving this project, has their eye not only on the ball of phases, activities, tasks, resources, budgets, etc., scope, but also on what are those business outcomes we're trying to achieve. And so we need to reshape our project planning. Traditionally, it's around the three things that we know: on time, on budget, on scope. And so we'd better put a portion of that time towards thinking about what those outcomes or benefits are. And by the way, the industry uses outcomes and benefits and results fairly interchangeably. I'm not going to get too hung up on that here. What we're talking about is what are the ultimate business results we're trying to achieve. And the last key finding was overmanage, meaning really emphasize the stakeholder involvement, because it's not the project team that gets the benefits, it's the stakeholders who are the recipients of those benefits. And the end, we'd better make sure we talk to them to understand what those activities and outcomes and results are that are truly going to affect those stakeholders, presumably in a positive way, but possibly in a negative way as well. So those are the 5 key lessons. Let me take this forward a little bit further and start to wrap some meat on the bones of these lessons here. So different way of looking at it. I'm sure you all know what's often referred to as this iron triangle. And there was a brilliant book written by Dr. James Norrie, who's a Canadian professor from Southwestern Ontario, called Breaking Through the Project Fog. You can see the reference on the right. Everyone knows the triangle. And there's also the joke that you've probably heard of, okay, of these 3, pick 2, and the third one is going to fail. I'm not going to go there into it. What I want to do is introduce the concept that he added, which is this: on strategy, which really means on the business benefits that we're trying to achieve. And so all of those 3 red elements that are part of the classic triangle had better all point towards delivering the strategic objectives of whatever that initiative is. And so it's a different way of looking at it that adds that extra flavor to it that is so important to making sure that the focus is truly on achieving the business results behind what that transformation is going to be. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're on strategy, that green circle that we just saw? Well, there's a few things, and this is the checklist, if you will, or the key elements that you really want to consider when you're undertaking a business transformation, either when you're in the planning phase or even as you're starting to build it along the way. It's never too late to do any of the 5 things that I'm about to show you. So get the right people in the room. Those stakeholders that study mentioned just a couple of slides ago, all of the people who will be affected, whether it's the folks who are in the administration of the program, whether it's the end recipients of whatever the benefit of that program is, whether it's senior management, whether it's partner organizations that are going to be involved in some way. Whoever's going to see some kind of a change in their environment, positive or negative, you need to make sure that they are involved really early on, not just in the building of the thing, whatever that transformation is, but in that business result. Next, use some kind of a method, and I'm going to cover this off very shortly in the subsequent slides, that will actually surface those expectations, that will actually build consensus around what are those results going to be. Are we going to see an increase in efficiency? Are we going to see a decrease in cost, a decrease in cycle time, speed to process whatever the initiative is, whatever the transaction is? Of course, you'll need KPIs, right? You need to set out targets at the beginning to say, here's what we expect to achieve. And then we can see as we go forward, how are we actually achieving them? And they should be around leading and lagging or even intermediate indicators. So things that will tell you early on, are we on track? Things that will tell you, are we doing well? And things that will tell you, have we achieved what those original business benefits were in the first place? I do see a lot of folks attaching KPIs to the activities. So are we on time? Are we on budget? And so on and so on. And that's fine from a project management point of view, but it's not good enough to actually get those desired benefits all the way through. Incorporate risks. What I do see very often is people assume that everything will be fine and that if we build it, we'll get those those results, along the way. But in fact, there are risks that could trip us up. And so those risks might be assumptions. If we assume that we'll get an adoption rate of a new program or a new service of 50% of the population, well, what if there are certain things that are inhibiting the population from not getting to that program and adopting it? What if we need to incorporate other players through the process to be able to collaborate to make this happen? There can be an infinite number of risks, and these are risks to the outcomes, not risks to the project. That's the difference in number 4. And of course, mitigations for those risks. And finally, package this up and make sure that they are in whatever the final form of the justification of this transformation is. It's likely a business case, may very well be a Treasury Board submission, which is supposed to include the business case anyways. And as Stephen mentioned in the introduction, having written both the business case guide and the outcome management guide for Treasury Board Secretariat, the two fit right together. All of the desired business outcomes fit right into the business case, which fit right into the TB submission when you do it right. So let me talk about how we actually get those servicing of the outcomes. And you may see logic models or results chains right away. You may groan. If this was an interactive session, I would expect to hear some groans because logic models have been around for a while. They're not good enough is what I'm going to suggest, and I'll explain why as I take you through the next couple of slides and show you some examples. For one reason, one of the key reasons is logic models tend not to involve all of the stakeholders. They tend to involve the project team who go, we think this is what's going to happen. It also involves a list of things that aren't connected to each other. It also involves some very imprecise language, and I'm going to show you a bit more of that coming right up. Things like enhanced capability or improved response time or things like that. And as I'll show you in a moment, these are simply not sufficient. And so quite a few years ago, I created for Treasury Board Secretariat, and frankly, I've used this in industry as well, this notion of the outcomes map that is more precise, more clear in terms of the connections and contributions, and incorporates the risks to the outcomes. And I'll be showing you a sample of one just coming up in a few moments. Of course, the business cases is, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the way we package all of that together. And obviously the policy and the directive on results, which is the latest and greatest version of how we think through the results we want to achieve as an organization, are also ways of measuring and surfacing those business outcomes. And so I've just put in here the references in case you need them. You will, of course, get a copy of these slides and you'll be able to reference them as you need. So here's where the groans will really happen. This actually has been around at least 15 years. In fact, it's now officially archived, but it's still a valid way of looking at a standard method. And I'm only going to take a minute on this one, and I'm going to move you to the more modern, more thorough method in a moment. Everything to the left of center here, everything to the left of the center line where I'm trying to show you with the cursor is all about things within our control. This is what project managers or project directors, whoever is overseeing the transformation, has all of the levers at their fingertips. The inputs, meaning the people, the capital equipment, knowledge, data, et cetera, all come together through activities, and we generate outputs. Outputs might be new systems, new processes, new actual benefits that come out of the application or of the transformation, whatever that is, tangible deliverables if you prefer. Everything to the right of that middle line starts to get to the outcomes or the results. And for the purpose of what I'm talking about here, that's the focus. What do we see immediately? It might be awareness of a new program. So let me take the SERB as the example. It's obviously no longer around, but it's still one that everyone will understand. The immediate outcome is people are aware of it. Intermediate outcome is that they apply and start to get the benefits of, I think it was $500 every 2 weeks or something along those lines. And the ultimate outcome is that we've sustained people who have lost all of their income over that period of time during the pandemic. And what the ultimate outcome would be, or the final outcome, sometimes this is referred to, is they didn't lose their homes. They were able to support their family, social considerations along the way, all of those things. And so that's the degree to which we start to see the benefits coming along and ultimately occurring. What's interesting is, and this is what makes people nervous, if you will, about the right-hand side, those three blue symbols, is that that's where we start to lose control. Everything to the left of the middle, as I mentioned, we have control of the resources, the activities, and the outputs. As we go out to our stakeholders, our users, our affected parties of the transformation, we can't control how they actually will respond. And so here's what I'd like to show you is a different approach. And I'm going to do it not in a theoretical way. I'm going to do it with a real example. And so let me give you a scenario first. So we all know that texting while driving is a problem. And so if we wanted to find a creative solution, here's what we might consider. 3 elements. Draft some better legislation beyond just the distracted driving laws that are used today. Set up an awareness campaign to make people much more aware of the dangers of texting while driving. Not all that dissimilar to what happened years ago with participation or non-smoking campaigns. Make people aware and you'll get behavioral changes. And we can also work with industry to find solutions. So if I'm sitting in the driver's seat, I can't take my smartphone out and start texting if there's some kind of an interlock or some other way of making my phone not work, so to speak, in the driver's seat. And so I like to call this, just for fun, if you text, you're next, just to be a little bit catchy and interesting about it. So the question is, and I'm going to show you this on the next slide, what's that right-hand side of the outcomes map, those 3 blue symbols? What are some of the immediate, intermediate, and final outcomes of this transformation? Because the transformation is going to do those 3 things that are the activities, the legislation, the awareness campaign, and working with industry. So what? Let me show you. So this slide is simply the nomenclature. I'm not going to spend any time on it. It's simply for reference. You'll see in the example coming up. So interestingly enough, just before I show it to you, I was asked to speak at the Canadian Police College a couple of months ago with police officers from across Canada and some international ones as well. They jumped all over this particular example because they're living this difficult situation every day. So these are the 3 activities that I just listed. 1, the no texting legislation. 2, the campaign for drivers and possibly for passengers, as you'll see in a moment. And 3 is working with industry. So those are the activities. Those are the project elements that you would naturally include in your transformation plan. What are the outputs, the actual tangible deliverables? Well, pass new legislation. Create the actual awareness campaign and broadcast it through whatever channels are appropriate, whether it's through internet advertising or billboards or whatever it might be. And the third one, the bottom gray one that you see, is actually create some kind of an interlock that industry and the vehicles have actually decided that can be done. I'm going to ignore the red symbol for the moment. I'm going to come back to it. So here's where we start to get to the outcome side. So the blue circled one is that first immediate outcome. So we can actually measure, and that's what the blue circle means. We want to measure this leading indicator to say, what is the awareness level? So if that campaign and if the official gazette where the legislation has been posted and media has jumped all over it, hopefully, then we should see an increase in awareness. So that implies we had to have taken a baseline before this transformation, and then we'd have to take a new measurement all the way through, and we'd probably want to keep measuring it. Now, the risk that is outside of our control, that's why it's a red stop sign, is we may not be able to reach all target audiences. There could be language difficulties, there could be cultural differences. We may not have a campaign that targets every single community group. So it's a recognition that we may not achieve every single person that we want to hit through this awareness campaign. What's the so what of that? Well, I've identified two elements. I'll show you the driver's one in a moment. From a passenger point of view, there might be a decreased passenger acceptance. So if you were in the passenger seat of a vehicle and whoever you were driving with pulled out their phone and started texting or checking their phone, you might say, hey, I would appreciate it if you were put your phone away. You should be aware of, or I'm aware of, the dangers or the difficulties involved in texting while driving. And so that social pressure is something that we want to take advantage of and actually see as an outcome along the way. The next element is where it all comes together. We should see a decreased incidence of texting while driving. And as you can see, there's three contributors to this. This is one of the key areas where this is much stronger than a traditional logic model, is that all three of these contributing arrows that you see here are all contributing towards our outcome of decreased incidence of texting while driving, which of course, ultimately, we want to get to decreased collisions. So it's not texting while driving is the problem, it's collisions resulting from texting while driving is the real problem. And so 07, this seventh outcome here, is one we actually want to measure as well. And so that's the result we're really trying to achieve here. So let me deal with a couple of risks that I've skipped over along the way. So the decreased incidence of texting while driving may not be achievable or fully achieved because of this yellow triangle you see towards the bottom. This non-compliance or consequences are insufficient. So for example, if it's a $20 fine and no demerit points, we'll go, that's fine, I'll pay the 20 bucks, right? And so how do we mitigate that? Well, we ensure that the penalties and the social stigma are severe. And so maybe we publish the names. There might be privacy considerations. Maybe we do other things to make sure that it's a significant penalty. I was just reading a couple of days ago in, I think it was Finland, where a gentleman who was speeding was fined, I don't remember the number, but it was something like over 100,000 euros because they make their penalties a proportion of your income. And so that way, if you have lots of money and you go, I can spend 20 bucks or even 100 bucks on a fine, that's an interesting way of getting compliance. The other risk that is outside of our control, this stop sign looking thing, is that there's always new devices. So I'm sure we were all just reading about Apple's Vision Pro, the new goggles that Apple has put out. Well, it won't be long before someone is driving with their Apple Vision Pro goggles, right? Now, maybe that's not strictly speaking texting while driving, but it's something that is certainly going to make the problem worse. That will result in an increased incidence of texting while driving or lack of a decrease, which will mean more texting related collisions again. And the one I skipped over is that the industry is not amenable to adding those warnings or interlocks. So sure, we can create those warnings, but industry is always trying to be creative, always trying to be innovative, and we love them for that, but it may work at cross purposes for what we're trying to achieve. So if we agree, if we're comfortable that decreased texting related collisions is the key point here, then let me take you one step further. What's the so what of that? Well, we'll get as a final outcome, decreased vehicle and property damage, fewer collisions, which will result in fewer societal impacts, fewer insurance costs. It'll also result in decreased rates of personal injury and death, and ultimately safer and healthier Canadians. So you can see how we link these to the gold ultimate outcomes here, which are likely going to be in the strategic objectives, possibly in the departmental performance framework that really do align to those strategic outcomes. And so there's three things that I want to just point out in summary on this, and then I will move on. The activities, the black boxes on the left, and the outputs, the gray ovals immediately to the right of those, that's typically what we have when we think of a transformation project. Let me just actually circle those. So this stuff here, that's typically what we think of. Everything to the right of that is what we want you to think of more. And that's what those lessons that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation are all about. Think about what are the immediate outcomes, the leading indicators, what are the more intermediate outcomes, or even the final outcomes along the way, such as these and these. By doing that, you can actually create a stronger business case, more buy-in, more consideration, and identification of what could go wrong, even if we deliver the project or the transformation on time and on budget. Like, for example, those two risks that I identified here, just as a couple of examples. And so this is a much more thorough way of really thinking through not only doing the transformation, but why are we doing the transformation? What's the end result? Or you can use this approach. It's funny, when we do this online, I don't hear the chuckles or laughter, which is just the way it is in this medium. But it's certainly an effective way of awareness, shall we say, sponsored by a funeral home. So I mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. I'm sure you've all heard of SMART indicators, SMART terminology for outcomes. I want to talk about the specific and measurable. And if we were doing this interactively, I would have you confess to me who uses these words all the time. And again, I'm either imagining the groans or the, yeah, that's me. You can tell by the red thumbs down that those aren't my favorite words, because I found this graphic recently. This says it perfectly. What happens in vagueness stays in vagueness, right? So if we're vague, if we're really not clear, if we say something's enhanced, I don't know what that really means. And so if we're that unclear, then we're not going to know that we're actually achieving anything. I won't go back to it, but I don't know if you noticed, but it was things like increased and decreased that I had on that outcomes map. And those are the kinds of words that we try to promote. You're not restricted to these 6 green words that you see on the right-hand side, but they're more indicative of more specific and measurable and precise, meaning SMART outcomes. And so let me take you through, I'm right on time actually. I've got a couple of examples that I want to show you. So this one is interesting. If we were to say 38 new schools in the Ottawa area, what does that really mean? And can we link it to, are we on the right track? So this is missing, and usually I do this interactively as well, but typically what I hear is, well, how many new schools did we plan to build? Did we plan to build 50, or did we plan to build 38 or 34? Because knowing that would tell us something. Did we build them in the right locations? Did we build them to the right specifications? Did we accommodate kids with autistic or special needs? Did we incorporate physical fitness into the schools? None of that shows up here. And so it's not a good outcome measure. I have another couple that I'm going to show you, and the third one in particular I'm going to spend another moment on. I was in Nashville the year before the pandemic started, and I was walking down literally Broadway, where all the clubs are, and I saw this. And I thought, what an interesting way of measuring their own performance and actually saying we must have changed something, transformed something to be able to give us a 6-minute ER wait time. Now, I'm not sure what the purpose of this billboard is, because if I'm walking down Broadway as I was, I clearly don't need the ER, the emergency room, and so I really don't care at that moment. If I'm in an ambulance rushing to the ER, well, I'll let the ambulance driver take me to the appropriate place for, and they can make the decision for me. I also note, and this is just a little bit of if you will, a cynical comment, there's only 2 digits on the stopwatch here. I think in Canada, we'd have to have 3 or 4 digits for our wait times. But my key point here is, what are we trying to do with this outcome information? Last one I'll show you. I was in Toronto at the Police Museum. It's on College, right near Yonge Street. And I saw this billboard right at the end. And I went, that's interesting. What do we do with this information? Would I think that going from 29 to 45 is bad news? Well, maybe. If we're coming out of the pandemic when people were traveling less, maybe that's an explanation. What if we look back the prior year and 2 prior years, and I'll just make up some numbers here. What if it was 200, then 100, then 29, then 45? We're definitely on a good downward trend. And yes, maybe it's blipped up a bit, but knowing that time-based series of history would put a very different perspective on these numbers. And then you'd have to factor in as well, were they pedestrians only who, like, of the 45 this year, was that all pedestrians? Was it motorists? What about cyclists? As cities add more bike lanes, what effect does that have? So it's missing all of the context that makes this real. Let me show you what to do about that. So there was a gentleman by the name of John Main who worked with the Office of the Auditor General, who gave us these, and we've used this in our PPX presentations. These 6 points really are the key to making this happen. Give the whole story, including the context and the expectations. Make sure that we have all of the contributions. What contributed? Did we have different law enforcement for the Toronto traffic deaths? Did we actually have more cyclists? Did the modal split change? Was it a particularly severe winter? What are all of the factors that contributed into making this happen? I won't read you them all. You've probably all read them by now. But this notion of what's the cause and effect, what are the contributors to it, is much more important than the number itself. And you'll have these slides as reference. So just to finish off, brilliant comment by Albert Einstein. Everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. And so to me, this is an argument that don't just measure it and state it as an outcome because it's easy to do so. Make sure you're really focused on the outcomes or the results that really matter. And that outcomes map that I showed you along the way helps identify those, as I've showed you the blue circled ones, those are the key outcomes that we really want to measure, that we really want to focus on, that we really want to make sure that we are achieving. Not just something that's actually in our transformation project, but something that we're trying to achieve as a business result. Last little bit, a quick story. previous Auditor General of Canada, unfortunately now the late Michael Ferguson, told this story, and I think it's a really good lesson to be learned through all of this. So back in the days of colonial rule by the British in India, there was a problem. There were a lot of venomous cobra snakes, and they were proliferating, and obviously it was a public health threat. And so what do you think happened? Well, the government at the time said, let's draft a program, let's set up a program. And if people bring in a dead snake, we'll give them a reward. Program was hugely successful at first, and it was starting to have a good effect. But people said, hey, you know what? There's money to be made here. Let's breed the snakes. And to be honest with you, I don't know the gestation period of a snake. I'll assume it's a couple of months or a few months or something like that. And the program was fairly long-lived, but they started to breed the snakes and brought them in and made more money. What do you think happened? The government realized that this breeding occurred. They probably exceeded their budget for the reward money that happened along the way. They canceled the program, canceled the reward. Makes sense? Seems like a reasonable reaction. What do you think happened? The breeder said, why am I keeping these snakes? They're costing me money now. I'm not going to get any money for them. Set them free. What do you think happened? Wild snakes, feral snakes, I don't know if you can use the word feral for snakes, multiplied, increasing the cobra population. What do you think happened from that? The result? The problem was made worse by the program, not better. So it was made better temporarily. The decrease in snakes happened, and then there was a net increase of cobra snakes as a result of the program. And so to me, the key lesson in here is remember that all programs, all transformations ultimately affect humans, right? Our population, and we're all susceptible to human nature and the reaction, the people side of the change, if you'd like to call it that. And so if you really think through and anticipate what are the possible reactions by our target population and all of the other stakeholders, and think it through that outcomes map, identify risks, then you'll actually have a successful program. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Steve, if you'd like to moderate, please.
Murray, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. I have a couple of self-serving questions I'm going to ask of you, but we're going to take one from the floor right now, and it is, how does policy regulations factor into your model to improve transformation efforts, as this tends to be the slowest, hardest obstacle to overcome?
Yeah. And did you say politics or policy?
Policy.
Policy.
And in brackets, regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So unquestionably, it can be difficult to put them in place. In fact, I'll refer back to the example I showed you. The first initiative in that texting while driving example was about drafting legislation. And so how you actually make that happen, I won't get into because likely the audience that we've got here knows that better than me anyways, but there might be a risk there. If Parliament is prorogued, or if it doesn't happen in a particular time frame, or if you can't get that legislation through, the policy doesn't change, all of those things could be risks to achieving those outcomes, no question about it. And so you do have to factor that in. The best thing you can do is actually include it as one or more additional risks along the way.
Okay, thank you, Murray. So the self-serving question. How important is it to have a strategic plan in place prior to starting to measure performance?
So I'm going to give you a quote from, I believe it's Alice in Wonderland, and I'll bet you didn't expect that answer from me. The quote is, when you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So in other words, to answer it in a more business-like fashion, strategic alignment is required. excuse me, so those outcomes that were on the far right, like safer and healthier Canadians was one of them in that outcomes map, that would likely be one of the strategic outcomes in the strategic plan. If you didn't have that, then you could probably kind of figure out where it goes. But if you actually have that strategic plan in place first, then you can have a much stronger alignment. And when you have that strong alignment with those strategic outcomes in the strategic plan, you'll have at least two things happen. One is you'll get better attention, if I can call it that, from the senior management or deputy heads, whoever it might be, who are involved in achieving that strategic plan. But you'll also get more buy-in across the organization because everyone's pulling in that same direction.
And to add on to that question, then it probably is really important to have your strategy and in turn your performance measures align with Government of Canada's strategic direction.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole notion of I keep calling it the new policy on results, is not new anymore, but the whole departmental results framework is in fact the structure, the framework to be able to do exactly that.
Thank you, Murray. Other questions? This is a great opportunity to ask Murray some really important questions. Want to just come in? Excuse me. Excuse me. The failure to achieve expected outcomes or unintended consequences often are not obvious until after the transformation project is over. How do you propose we don't get stuck in planning paralysis in thinking through risks?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I appreciate the reality reflected in that question for sure. Hang on a second. Excuse me. So there is a trade-off here. Neither extreme, as usual, is the right answer. Analysis paralysis, I absolutely agree. If you take months and months and months to figure this out and everything else waits, you've lost that window of opportunity. But I would argue that similarly, the fail to plan, actually, I've just remembered an ancient expression, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? That's a nice encapsulated way of answering the question. So basically, if you talk to the various stakeholders and ask what can go wrong, right? In other words, what we anticipate these outcomes, do you think we can achieve them? Do you think we can achieve them to the level that we need to? Do we actually need to make sure that all of the stakeholders are aligned to make this happen? Asking those questions of the stakeholders, doing those consultations, will take you a long way to mitigating the risk that you've asked in that question. In other words, if we don't talk to those stakeholders, then we have a blind spot. If we do talk to them, then we'll probably surface some particular stakeholder groups that will have a problem with this or will not react as well as we think they will, even though we think this transformation is the best thing since sliced bread. And so by talking to them for at least a moderate amount of time at the beginning, then we'll be able to mitigate or identify first and then mitigate as many of those risks as possible. But I agree, there is a sweet spot between not doing what I just said at all and overdoing it for years and years and years and not getting the thing off the ground.
We have another one. Have we progressed since the government adopted the deliverology approach?
So that's a complex answer to that question. So if just a tiny bit of background. So deliverology came from the UK. It was first incorporated in the province of Ontario, in fact, and then some of the same people actually worked with PCO and PMO, and I worked with some of them, in fact, along the way. And it's basically a results-oriented approach. The government of Canada took that into the policy of on results and the various other elements. And this whole departmental results framework and all of the other elements behind it are in fact a tangible a deliverable or a tangible representation of that deliverology approach. And so what you've got is the philosophy of deliverology that's still there. I can tell you as an unbiased manner as I possibly can, I've looked at many other governments around the world, mostly Western societies, of course, and I can tell you that the approach that Canada has is still one of the strongest, in that this notion of mandate letters that ministers are given, the fact that there are a few hundred KPIs, performance indicators, outcomes that are trying to be achieved. They're not perfect. Many of them are things like enhanced and streamlined and so on. But the structure and the framework by which it's actually done is actually one of the stronger ones that I've seen in the dozen or so countries that I've looked at around the world. So to answer the question, I believe, yes, we have progressed. If you think of departmental results frameworks, they're now quite embedded and people are aligned with it. All of the strategic outcomes that are there in place allows us to align, similar to the question that you asked originally, Steve, which allows us to make sure that all of our efforts are pointing in the same direction.
Another question. How important is it to have a champion when you're doing these types of things?
Mm.
How do you find the champion and how do you hold on to the champion?
So how important is it on a scale from 1 to 10? Probably 20. So in other words, absolutely, you need to have that champion. Without that champion, you just don't have the momentum. If you do have the champion, it's a pull. If you don't have the champion, it's a push. And everybody knows it's a lot harder to push things along than it is for someone to pull it along. I don't have any secret sauce for finding the champion. It obviously has to be someone with enough influence in the organization, someone, quite frankly, someone for whom this is important. And by important, I mean personally important to their role in the organization, but also institutionally important in that it should show up in their performance management accord. Whatever their performance is driven by, that's one of the ways that they'll know it's important, not only to them personally, but to their organization.
Great answer. All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? So I say great opportunity to talk to an expert about these types of things.
And you do have my coordinates. I would be more than happy if you wanted to follow up afterwards. Shoot me an email. Happy to talk to you about this afterwards to see how you can adopt some of these approaches, how you can adjust the way you're going to be able to, as the question was asked a few moments ago, not get stuck in analysis paralysis, but also think about these things up front. Because if you can actually identify what the value is in terms of these final outcomes, you'll actually get more interest in your organization, and people will say, okay, so it's not just about the transformation project, it's about the business results we're going to get. And I can get excited about that.
One more question. This requires government officials to have good evaluation and performance management skills. Do you find that capacity is there?
Yeah, great question as well. So honest answer is it varies by organization, by department or agency. And so there are some that do have very good skills that way and others that don't. It's actually why PPX, just a quick word about them for the moment. PPX, if people don't know, the Performance and Planning Exchange is a completely volunteer-run organization that actually stemmed from Treasury Board. I think it's now 21 years ago, if my memory serves me right. And so it's a bunch of us who have volunteered to promote both performance measurement and evaluation along the way, and the planning up front. And so one of the, as Steve mentioned in the introduction, I've taught courses for PPX for many years, and part of PPX's mandate is to improve that capacity, in fact. And in some cases, some organizations have to go external to help them with performance management and evaluation as well. So it really does vary.
All right. Once again, thank you so very much. I'd like to thank you and all the other speakers. It's been a great day. I'd like to thank the participants for making this a very informative and highly productive first day. And there is a wrap-up session, I believe, hosted or starting in the next few minutes. You may want to attend that. And if not, hopefully we'll see everyone tomorrow for day 2 of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the conference, everybody. Thank you, Steve.
Right out. Thanks, Murray.